Western Edge. Just a little brief on this story that I'm about to read. A Night at the Dead Rabbit. It's based in New York, based on a couple that are completely fictional, and came to me as an idea of, after being married for a few years, eventually all the good times, all the fun times, you do hit a rut every now and then. And if you have kids, if you don't have kids, you're going to experience it no matter what. This story is all about just one night out and what could possibly happen in the world of fiction. So I hope you enjoy. Night at the Dead Rabbit by Tom Foster. Read by Tom Foster. Honey? Honey? This time there's no response save for the sudden eruption of a grating, grinding snore as he opened his mouth wide, his head tilting back as she could see up his nose and smell his breath. Instantly, the last glass of punch she'd downed started to rise, tickling the back of her throat as it attempted to abandon ship. She moved away just in time, clapping one hand over her mouth as she collapsed next to her husband on the padded sofa in the private room they found themselves in. Doing her absolute best, she succeeded in not vomiting all over the sofa, the plush carpet beneath her feet, or the dress that had cost her way too much for a single date night. It took some doing, but she continued to keep it down, gasping as she took her hand away from her mouth. With that crisis averted, she glanced around desperately for a way out. Or something that she could use to her advantage. It was no use. There was nothing in sight that she might use as a weapon, and anything she might have thought about throwing was either bolted to the floor or too heavy for her to lift. They were going to die, and her husband, God love him, was too drunk to even notice. A loud snort, followed by an eye-watering explosion of gas that wafted up cheerily from the cushions, caused her to retch again as she was forced to stand up. "Well, I'm glad you're so concerned," she muttered, still looking around the room. Wringing her hands nervously, she couldn't help but smile at her husband as she tried to decipher just how things had gone so horribly wrong that night. Only a few hours ago they'd been on a lovely date, laughing and enjoying themselves and all but forgetting the rut that they'd sunk into over the years. It seemed almost too tragic to believe that they were about to end it here, in a pub named after a dead mammal and run by a bunch of thugs. Of course, they hadn't known that coming in. They just wanted a night out in the town, a chance to be free and wild without their 3 children getting in the way. Her husband shifted in his seat, and as he did, the cushion shook as he farted loudly once more. Shaking her head, she held her nose as she attempted to find another way out of this mess. Meanwhile, earlier that day... "Mom, I can't find my socks." "They're in your drawer," she called from downstairs. "Where I put them." "Why did you put them there?" called her eldest child, Miranda, sounding put out that her mother would do something right. Instead of replying out loud, again, she muttered, "Because I'm a mom, and how dare I do anything that makes sense." Hair disheveled, wearing clothes that hung on her like rags, Mackenzie Morris was the stereotypical house mom, or at least she appeared to be. In truth, she was continually busy each day, from the moment she and her husband James woke their 3 wonderful, caring children. "Mom, where'd you put my books? Mom, I need my shirt ironed," to the moment they came home, when she began to imagine strangling them one by one. She loved her family dearly, but living with 3 teenagers and a husband that was, at times, more like a stranger passing in the night had begun to wear on her only 2 years ago. She hadn't said anything for so long that it felt like she, too, was beginning to fade into the background. Her own business, a freelance writing site she'd opened 3 years prior, had taken off and become a lucrative idea that she no longer had to run on her own, which was one of the few upsides to life. It was run primarily by those she had hired, placed in charge, and instructed not to screw up. They were people she could trust and easily monitor, but she still kept tabs on them every now and then. Her family, on the other hand, was not so easily handled. "Your books are on the living room table where you left them, Jared, and you know how the iron works, Jamie." "But, Mom," came the answering reply, which was eerily close to sounding like a chorus of the damned as she closed her eyes, standing near the staircase of their 2-story home and raising her voice just enough to be heard by all. "So help me, children, if I have to repeat all that verbatim, I will be forced to go full Goonie on all of you! Do you want the full Goonie?" For several seconds, blessed silence reigned. Then the front door opened, and her husband, a short, dark, and pleasingly handsome man, walked in with a gentle smile as he stepped close, going hip to hip with her as he smiled in return. Appreciating the gesture, Mackenzie rewarded him with a small kiss as he gently swayed back and forth, their rhythm causing her to feel a moment of harmony just for a few seconds. "Full Goonie?" he asked, to which she nodded. "Must have been a good day then. The kids aren't hanging from the ceiling." She closed her eyes. "Yet," she mouthed silently. Full Goonie was a term that they had developed when the kids were still little. What it meant was kind of goofy, but as it developed over the years, it had come to mean that Mom and Dad were about to blow their stack and take drastic, over-the-top measures to ensure that their home didn't become the madhouse it usually was. Only once in the past few years had they been forced to go full Goonie, and that had been highly satisfying, but a lot of work. She had, in effect, taken a page out of the 1985 film The Goonies, for which their family threat was named, and concocted a brilliant scheme to wake up the kids without having to be in the same room at the time. It had been complicated, but the effort had been appreciated, at least by her and her husband. Now, whenever the term full Goonie was uttered, the kids fell into step without question. Unfortunately, that had become the high point of their lives for quite some time, as she and James hadn't managed to get away from their kids for more than a single night in 3 years. They attended social functions, birthday parties, and even family functions, but it wasn't the same. She hadn't gotten alone and to herself for so long that she was beginning to forget what dating was even like. "Hey, honey, can I see you in the kitchen?" James called out, causing her to frown in mild confusion. Normally when he came home from work, he would grab a beer, head for the couch, and only move again if she needed something or when dinner was ready. Intrigued, she made her way into the kitchen, but almost stopped when Miranda called down. "Hey, Dad!" "Full Goonie!" James thundered from the kitchen, startling Mackenzie for the moment as she smiled. Miranda predictably did not call down again. As she walked into the kitchen, she discovered that her heartbeat was elevated just a bit, though she couldn't figure out why. James was there, beer in hand, but in his other hand, he was holding out a glass of wine. This was mundane and quite out of the blue, but she couldn't help but gape at him and take the preferred glass. He was smiling at her as he raised his eyebrows up and down in a suggestive manner. It was still early evening, neither of them was drunk, and he was making a move. Mackenzie quickly took the glass and clinked it against his bottle, raising her own eyebrows as she moved closer to him. "What's the occasion, handsome? You know I can't resist alcohol and eyebrows." He grinned at her as he took a swig of his beer, swallowing before he said, "We, my dear, are going on a date." She didn't know how to respond at first. It had been so long, but as he wrapped one arm around her, Mackenzie didn't fight it, grinning warmly as she put her free arm around him. How nice. Where is my husband, and what have you done with him?" James grinned wide. "Well, for tonight, Mrs. Morris, your husband is away, and Mr. McManus wants to play." She stopped, only an inch from kissing him as she frowned, still smiling. "Come again?" James's grin widened as he pulled back just enough to view her fully as he said, "I got this great idea from Josh at work." "You mean Josh, that I'm a pervert and proud of it, Josh?" she asked sarcastically. Yeah, him," James said, going on despite the look she gave him. "He gave me the idea that we could spice up our marriage a bit by playing out these different roles." He was still grinning. "We meet as strangers in a bar somewhere and just, start talking and see where it goes." "Spice up our marriage?" she asked in an incredulous tone. "Are you serious? You took advice from a guy who thinks monogamy is a type of wood." James looked a little crestfallen, but she wasn't buying into it. A tiny spark of something, an idea, or maybe just hope that she could go along with this, was starting to pulse in the back of her mind, but she couldn't commit quite yet. It was almost offensive to think that James would feel the need to be someone else with her. But then, they hadn't been the same people for years now, so why not? James, who was still trying hard not to look dejected, continued, "I just wanted a night out. A night where we don't have to be ourselves. I wanted to do something a little different." "What's wrong with being herself?" she asked, though she was quickly trying to see the upside of this. It might even be a little fun, but making him work for it was fun too. "I don't know," he said, now looking fully dejected. "I just thought, it might be fun to play a role, just to see how it goes and all." Mackenzie sighed, shaking her head as she looked away. On one hand, her husband was being spontaneous, something she loved and didn't get nearly enough of. But on the other, it almost seemed insulting that they couldn't just love each other the way they were. But if she was going to be honest, who they really were had been kind of dulled down around the edges ever since the kids had been born. James had tried, but over the years their sex life had kind of fizzled, for lack of a better word. So really, what could be the harm? Several hours later. They were out the door only a few hours later, with the children being given explicit instructions on how to behave, where the food was at, and that they were not to call unless someone was near death or otherwise in mortal danger. The threat of full Goonie had been firmly laid down once again, and the kids knew better than to challenge this. The trip into the city only took a short ride from their home, and before they knew it, New York had embraced them fully. Despite being a pub, the Dead Rabbit grocery and grog shop was quite an attractive sight from the outside, and once inside, Mackenzie could appreciate the allure of the place. From the outside, it looked like a strange cross between a local grocery store and a fine dining restaurant. Inside, the rustic but still elegant look had been spread around with such expert care that if one didn't know this place housed an upscale tavern, they might have mistaken it for a fancy yuppie hangout. It was the type of old-fashioned place that harkened back to a simpler day when New York had been very, very different. But the atmosphere of the place was quite lively. As they stepped into the tavern area, it quickly appeared that this place was a favorite hangout of the suit-and-tie variety of people, as Wall Street brokers and businessmen were scattered from one end to the next. James quickly disappeared into the crowd as they had planned, making his way to the upper room that he discovered online, presumably to wait for Miss O'Toole, who was supposed to be joining him shortly. Dressed now in a slinky evening gown that accentuated her figure, earned after years of constant jogging and fitness routines, Mackenzie was getting appraising stares from many of the younger men in the crowd, which she honestly didn't mind. She and James had prided themselves on staying in shape throughout the years, and had obviously agreed with them. More than one younger man attempted to buy her a drink, but she politely declined as she made her way upstairs, feeling positively sexy now that she had so many men paying attention to her. Mackenzie felt a flush rise to her cheeks as she wondered just how far James was willing to play this, discovering that she felt almost certain that she might be up for anything, or, at least, whatever her husband was comfortable with. As she neared the bar, she could see James, Mr. McManus, appearing as though he was waiting on someone. Time to make her big entrance, then. Mr. McManus, she purred, going so far as to allow her fingers to drift seductively along the back of his hand. The man of her dreams turned with a gentle grin upon the grizzled features, one eyebrow rising slightly as he replied, "Yes, and you are?" "Bethany O'Toole," she said softly, her eyes alight with excitement. So invested in her role was she that Mackenzie did not take note of the bartender's slight frown, nor his silent signal to someone in the near distance. "Care to buy a lady a drink?" "Barkeep," he said without looking. "A Scotch for the lady. Neat." He held up two fingers, still grinning as he continued to face her. "Oh my," she managed to blush. "How did you know?" "I have a way with people," he said in a seductive tone. "Women especially." She managed a girlish giggle as she turned away demurely for a second. Oh yes, this was so much fun. But as she gasped, she looked at his ring finger, deciding to up the ante just a bit to see what he would do. "Oh, it's too bad," she said, pouting slightly. "I didn't know you were married. Perhaps I should wander along now." "Nonsense," he said, picking up immediately as he winked. She had him, and it was good. What my wife doesn't know will hurt us. She made a shocked O with her lips, though her eyes still sparkled. Any other woman might have belted him across the mouth just then, but deep down she was thrilled. His wink had already alleviated any concerns over whether he was playing the role, and at that moment she felt an electric jolt of excitement that demanded they continue. "Mr. McManus," she crooned, "you are a naughty, naughty boy." She moved closer, licking her lips so she could see that he was getting good and excited. It was just then that the bartender cleared his throat to gain their attention, a development that caused both of them to turn and face him, faces still pressed in close. "Did I forget to tip?" Mr. McManus asked, looking absolutely perturbed. "No, sir, not at all," the bartender smiled warmly. "I just thought you and your companion might be better served to visit one of our private rooms, with our compliments to you, Mr. McManus." James's mood changed swiftly to one of gratitude, though Mackenzie felt a mild stab of uncertainty. Before she could voice a concern, however, the bartender spoke again. "Don't worry over your drinks. We'll have them brought up, along with a complimentary treat reserved for esteemed guests." "Well, James," Mr. McManus said with a smile, "I I thank you, my good man. I believe a tip is in order. Not necessary, sir. Bartender smiled. It's a pleasure to serve men such as you, Mr. McManus. Perhaps it was just part of being a parent, but alarm bells were ringing in her head as Mackenzie followed her husband without another word as they were led from the bar by a tall, dour-looking younger man. She wanted to say something, but she didn't want to ruin the evening either, so, following behind, she hoped and prayed that her misgivings were completely off at this moment. A little while later, there were moments she really hated being right. They'd been shown to a private room, as the bartender had said, which was quite lavish in design and comfort. The large sectional sofa that dominated the wall to the left of the door was very nice, and the open bar across the room was stocked full of vintage alcohols that their guide had informed them were there for their pleasure. When their drinks had arrived, they had also been given a medium-sized punch bowl of some colorful, fruity concoction that Mr. McManus had thoroughly enjoyed. In fact, he had enjoyed it so much he had probably passed out after his second glass. Finally, dropping the Miss O'Toole persona, Mackenzie had attempted to make herself feel better by curling up beside James, who had been fast asleep, sacked out on the couch much as he might have done at home. A faint smile had creased her lips as she lay against her husband, feeling his warmth and reminding herself that no matter what, the roles they played and the reality they shared were what she wanted the most. Of course, much as it happened in the movies, such tender moments spent in a strange place with one of the characters already experiencing feelings of unease were meant to be shattered. Just as she had been about to fall asleep on her gently snoring husband, the door crashed open and no less than 6 hardened, very dangerous-looking thugs had filed into the room. One of them, obviously the leader, staring down at them with obvious disdain. "This is McManus?" he asked the others, one of whom happened to be the bartender. "This weak puke? And who is she?" "Some broad he was meeting," said the bartender, glaring openly at her and the dozing McManus. It was absurd, but Mackenzie was suddenly rooting around in her small purse, opening the clasp and searching for her wallet. "I knew we should have tipped you," she said quietly. "Keep your money, whore," the lead man said, forcing a shocked O to form on Mackenzie's lips as she frowned in displeasure. "I am not. Just shut it," the lead man said, looking as though he might soon smack her. "You shut your filthy pile-licking." James jerked slightly where he lay, but did not wake as he snorted and then went back to snoring. "He's 3 sheets to the wind," the leader said in disgust, turning on the bartender. "I told you to keep him subdued, not plowed." "It's not my fault," the bartender cried. "Normally people only take 1 glass of punch. Most think it's too sweet and don't bother with any more. How's I know he's going to drain the whole damn thing?" "Brugger's not going to be pleased," the leader said. He wanted McManus awake and alive to see what he was going to do. Mackenzie seemed to have been forgotten, but she spoke up. She did her best to keep her voice from quavering. "Sir, I don't know who you think we are, but I—" "Oh, shut it," he said with a growl. We know too well who this lump of nothing is," he pointed at James. "He's the bookie that cost our boss a whole 10 grand on last month's race, and the boss wants to make an example of him." Her mouth formed a shocked O again, but this time it was terror that stained her gaze, not anger. "Nothing to do for it," the leader said, shrugging with disgust. "We're gonna have to wait until he comes to. Rugger's on his way anyway, you don't want him marked up." With that, he motioned for the others to leave, following with a snore of disgust as Mackenzie and James, before slamming and locking the door behind him. And with that, they had come to this present moment, stuck in a room with armed thugs who would eventually return with their boss in tow. James snorted, coming awake suddenly as he tried to sit up and groan from the headache he was no doubt suffering at that very second. "Oh, I'm sorry, honey. That last one really put me out." "James, we gotta get out of here," she said hurriedly. "We need to leave. Now." "Well, Miss O'Toole," he began with a sordid chuckle. She pursed her lips. "Honey, I appreciate the gesture and everything, but Miss O'Toole has gone off to soil herself for the moment, and Mr. Morrison's sorry, I'll go over that line. Honey, I appreciate the gesture and everything, but Miss O'Toole has gone off to soil herself for the moment, and Mrs. Morrison is desperately in need of her husband." He frowned, not understanding, but as she told him what had transpired only minutes before, his eyes went wide. His jaw dropped as the implication quickly set in. His eyes scanned the room, doing the same she had done when she had been debating on what to use as a weapon. The bar was the obvious answer, as the bottles could be used as ranged and up-close weapons if pressed. But she was certain that the thugs had guns, and so would their boss. Still, it was better than nothing. "Get behind the bar," he said quickly, joining her as he grabbed two heavy-looking bottles. She did the same, looking at him as he looked back at her. "Honey, whatever happens, I love you," she said, her voice strong even as tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. "I love you too," he said, "and I'm sorry I got us into this." She managed to smile, shaking her head as she said, "Oh, Mr. McManus, you certainly know how to show a girl a good time." Just at that moment, they could hear the lock being disengaged on the other side of the door, and it was open. A single figure entered, followed by the same thugs that had been there earlier. The newcomer was about as imposing as a teddy bear, his height seeming to be the only part about him that seemed capable of making him a threat. Otherwise, he had a great big belly, a walrus-like mustache, and eyes that sparkled with mirth as he looked around the room. Upon seeing James and Mackenzie, he frowned as he spoke. "You idiots," he fumed. "This isn't McManus." The leader of the group quailed a bit as he backed away. The older man, Rugger presumably, looked back to Mackenzie and James. "Folks, if you please lower the bottles. I believe we might be able to sort this out." "We just want to leave, peacefully," James said quickly, still tense to throw if it came down to it. Rugger held up both hands. "And I'd like to let you, preferably with a 30-old bottle of Balvenie unharmed. It's rather expensive, you know." James, who hadn't known, placed the bottle gently on the bar with wide eyes and much care as you might have shown while settling down a bottle of nitroglycerin. He mouthed the word, "Wow," as he let go of the bottle. "Yes, well, on many accounts," Rugger said as he aimed a cross look at his small group, who were now filing out of the room in response to his glare. As he turned back around, however, he offered the couple a disarming smile as he crossed the room. "Now, if I might implore you to grab us 3 glasses, miss, I believe we can sort this out over a nice bit of that drink." As it turned out, being McManus wasn't the wisest idea, but Rugger had let them off with a friendly warning and a promise that if they came to his pub again that they would be treated like royalty, with one request. They could never, ever, ever repeat anything they'd seen, which was extremely little, to anyone. So far as anyone knew, the Dead Rabbit was and had always been a legitimate place of business and would remain so. It was an agreement that James and Mackenzie had made quite readily. "So," Mackenzie asked as they walked along the waterfront, having decided to take a nice, relaxing stroll, "do you think it's a good idea to befriend a mobster?" "It's better than telling him no," James said, inhaling heavily through his nose as he continued to pay attention to his steps. They were walking by a large park that was draped heavily in shadows, the playground equipment swaying gently in the mild breeze that came off the water. "He made us an offer we can't refuse," she said, using her best impression of Marlon Brando, which was truly horrible. It made James laugh, though, and that was worth it. "It's too bad they came crashing in, though," she said ruefully. "I was almost there." "Would you have really?" he asked, knowing full well that she knew what he was talking about. "Oh, honey, you act like I never have." "So that's how the kids were conceived," he said, earning a laugh and a playful punch on his arm. He looked around as they kept walking. "You know, no one's around now, and I'm wide awake." She stopped, frowning as she clucked her tongue at him. "Honey, we're in public." "So," he said, "there's no one around, and, I do owe you a pleasant end to a messed-up evening." Instead of continuing to argue against it, she did a quick sweep of the area. There was indeed no one in their immediate vicinity, and to be honest, there was a nice big play structure with plenty of room for 2. "I suggest then, Mr. Morris, that you stretch first, because it might be a tight fit." She said this suggestively, walking off towards the structure, swaying just enough to be enticing. James grinned as he watched her go, undoing the buttons of his shirt as he began walking towards her and then running. After a few more steps, she broke into a run of her own, at which point it became a foot race to see who could make it to the structure first. Giggling all the way, Mackenzie found that she couldn't have asked for a better end to a truly strange and terrifying night. The end.